Well, I'll start by just saying how honored I am that Amor agreed to do this because, well, for many reasons, but the biggest one is that one of the most fun events that I did, I think, for Orphan Train was with Amor, and we were actually at the Center for Fiction before it moved to Brooklyn.
Not Orphan Train.
It was Piece of the World?
Piece of the World.
Was it?
Yep.
Gosh, they all blurred together. Yeah. All I remember is being so amazed by how fun you were, and people were just leaning forward in their seats.
Oh, sure.
But also, I was thinking today how much I regret that we can't go out, for drinks and dinner like we did to that very glamorous restaurant afterwards.
Yes, right.
We just are by ourselves.
This is to you. Cheers to you. Congratulations on the launch of Exiles. It's very exciting to be here on the premiere night. And so to the health and the success of the book, and congratulations.
Thank you. Everybody take a drink of whatever you have.
Exactly. Everybody at home, drink something.
I have to say, this has been so hard won because of COVID and the fact that everything is different and there's no tour, and it's here we are talking to each other. I'm in Southwest Harbor, Maine. You're in Garrison, New York, you said?
Yes.
Last night we lost power for 5.5 hours. So this would have been impossible last night. I'm glad it's tonight, but it's very odd. It's very odd, but fun.
Fun, great fun.
Yeah.
So can I ask you a question now? Can I go ahead? For those of you who haven't, of course it goes backwards. Apologize for that. Upside down, backwards. Thank you. Yes, in the background there, that works up back. It's so much fun to be here to talk about your new book, which is such an adventure and such an investigation and such a variety of human challenges, which we can come to. But I'd love to start by talking to you or asking you about the origins of the story. You mention briefly in the acknowledgments that the crafting the book was kind of 3 different threads of your own experiences, which came together, and it sounds like almost like subconsciously. But
yeah.
Can you sort of introduce everybody? And let me say this too, because I'll save Christina this problem, or this. The book Exiles, the exiles in question refer to the fact that this is a novel set in the mid-19th century about some women, several women, 2 in particular, 3, I guess, who are arrested in England and end up being sent to Australia in lieu of being sent to prison in England, which was, a custom of the time. And we follow them to Australia. And meanwhile, there are indigenous people in Australia who are under duress as well, as England is taking over that part of the world. And so we follow the threads of not only these 3 exiles who are coming from England, but also a young indigenous girl who in a way becomes an exile in her own homeland. And sort of their lives sort of come together in this story. So it's really quite an extraordinary sort of setup. But so given that, I'd love to sort of hear about those 3 threads and how they surfaced, for how they kind of percolated up into this, which is a very ambitious, and I mean that in the best of ways, an ambitious story to tell. When you get an instinct to tell a story like this, there must have been a moment where you're like, "Ooh, this is going to be a tough one."
There were many.
You totally pull it off, but it is. I can imagine it being intimidating to sort of have the story grab hold of you as something that you want to tell.
Yeah, there were many moments of intimidation. It's not my country. It's not my world. What the heck am I doing telling this story about Australia? There was a lot of that. I guess remind me, or I'll remind you that I've never really talked about the historical underpinnings of the whole reason that convict women were sent is a fun story. It's not answering your question, but I'd like to talk about it. Anyway, so to answer your question though, I stumbled on an article in the New York Times that immediately inspired me to write a book. I mean, you and I have talked over lunches many a time about the sources of inspiration and where those come from. And you don't always know when you're writing a book, all the pieces that led to it. I can tell you that I was captivated by the story I read in the New York Times, But it wasn't until I finished writing the book that I actually understood why I was interested in that story that wouldn't have drawn everyone's interest. And the reasons are that when I was in graduate school, it began when my father took a sabbatical year with my younger sisters and my mother to Australia, and he read The Fatal Shore. He's a historian. He was going to teach for a year at a university in Melbourne, and he read The Fatal Shore, and then he gave me his copy of this marked up, dog-eared book, underlined. And I was as captivated as he was. It was just a remarkable story about what was then called the founding of Australia. They don't call it that anymore, but about the British invasion, basically, of Australia. But the chapter that interested me most, one chapter, was called Bunters, Mollies, and Sable Brethren. And it was about the convict women and the Aboriginal people. Only one chapter in this 688-page book. The rest of it was about the male convicts. So that was the chapter that interested me most, and I was curious about that story. So I had the opportunity to apply for this fellowship to Australia, and it was a Rotary fellowship. I was there for 6 weeks as an ambassador, an American. I toured like cheese factories and timberlands and things like that. I wore a blue jacket. It was very fun.
So there were more than one of you ambassadors at the same time?
Ambassadors from the great state of Virginia, where I was in graduate school. And we spent 6 years touring Australia and being feted by Rotary clubs all over Australia. And it was paid for, which was delightful. But when I was there, I wanted to sort of learn more about the history. So I asked all these obnoxious questions. And I did not get a great response because people didn't really want to talk about their very complicated history. We know from our own country that it's not always easy to talk about the legacy of slavery in our country, the legacy of what happened to Native Americans, et cetera, et cetera. And so in Australia, there has been something similar. Anyway, I went home, I loved Australia, but that was that. And I wrote a book with my mother on feminism called The Conversation Begins. And we interviewed 60 women who were mothers and daughters of the second wave of the women's movement. Believe it or not, this actually does have to do with my novel, because their voices were so powerful and interesting that I think that was what first propelled me in this direction of sort of telling women's stories and these stories that haven't been told. So soon thereafter, I taught in a women's prison. I think I was inspired by that experience of hearing all these stories. And I thought that, I was teaching in universities, but I thought what population could really benefit from telling their stories. And so I wrote a proposal and I went and I taught in the only all-female prison in New Jersey. And I learned a lot in that experience. I taught in the prison has 700 inmates, and 300 of them are in maximum security. And I taught in Supermax. So I had to go through 4 levels to get in. And those women were not going anywhere. They were there 20 years to life at least. And so part of what I experienced was what it's like for these women to be incarcerated. I became very interested in what that was. I think that in part led to Orphan Train because many of it was around that same time because many of those women had been in foster care. I have a foster kid in my novel. So all of that had happened. And then I opened the New York Times back when I was reading the paper version of the New York Times. And I discovered this article. Lisa Belkin used to have a column called Motherload. And she wrote about issues of interest to mothers. And I was a young mother, well, not so young, but my kids were kind of young. And this article was about convict women and their children on the ships and what that experience was like. And I thought, this is a story I don't know and that I don't think a lot of Americans know. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that all of these disparate pieces of my own history, the Australian part, the women telling their stories part, and the incarceration, the criminal justice system in America and beyond part was combining to make this storm of a book for me. Sorry, that was so long.
No, it's fascinating. So, can we actually dwell? I want to refer to one thing, which is that, there's these three incredible threads that you described, that your personal experiences. You go to Australia and you're fascinated by the visit and by the sort of the fact that they're not talking very openly about the background of the country. You're doing these interviews with mothers and daughters and around feminism with your mother. You volunteer in a prison where you're teaching convict women to write and to express themselves. These are all three very powerful experiences personally, and I can find the threads thematically of how those might have surfaced in the book. My question for you is how conscious were you when you kind of decided to write this book that those things would each play a role?
I was not conscious at all.
I bet.
Anything. I just found this story and I was absorbed by it. Yeah. And it wasn't until way late in the process when I was actually, when it was, this is crazy. This is going to sound ridiculous. It was when I was writing the acknowledgments at the end. I started to write the story of how this came to me. And I realized, oh, holy Moses, these are these parts.
Yes.
Another thing, which is that after I wrote A Piece of the World, and while I was working on this novel, I was in conversation at New York Public Library with a writer named Lisa Gornick, who's an amazing novelist, wonderful thinker. And we had this kind of intense conversation, and we later adapted it for poets and writers. And it was about what it means to be writing fiction that's set in the past. There's a whole question about historical novels as a thing. I feel that's kind of female ghetto, but I understand the term, but that was part of what I was talking about. Anyway, in the course of having this conversation, we both did all this sort of writing about history. We read Hilary Mantel, her essays about writing her amazing books. And we found this essay by Jill Lepore in The New Yorker called Just the Facts Man. Jill Lepore is this incredible writer. And in this piece, she said that fiction does what history doesn't but should, which is to tell the story of ordinary men. And she went on to say, and who are these ordinary men? Well, a lot of them are women. And when I read that line, I realized that's sort of what I've been doing in my recent novels, which is telling stories that have been hidden in plain sight or have been not part of what we would, in any sense of the word, really call history.
One of the things that recurs in this book, I want to ask you about, was a number of the characters are literally orphans or quasi-orphans or become orphans. Several of the main characters, in essence, are so, both coming from England or in Australia. The indigenous young indigenous girl, in essence, is an orphan too. What do you think is that? And I don't have. What does that mean? What is that? Why are you drawing? And of course, you wrote The Orphan Trade, and so I kind of was fascinated in as a writer who's telling these stories, how you get drawn to the tales of orphans. And Oliver Twist shows up later in the novel too, as a reference. And I can imagine as a writer why that might be true. But I'm kind of fascinated for whether you've thought about that at all.
Well, I did think of it a lot when I was writing Orphan Train. There's a whole history of novels written about orphans. For one thing, I suppose it's biologic. It's easier to sort of tell a story about an orphan in a way. But I will say with this novel and with Orphan Train that that people on the lowest rungs of the social ladder in our society have often gone through some tremendous trauma. And a lot of times that's losing a parent or parents, because you don't have any safety net then. And so you then find yourself in this precipitous situation where you're falling from grace. And a good example of that is my character Evangeline, who opens the book. For me, this character, who was educated, her father's a vicar. He raised her to read lots of books, and he taught her Greek and Latin, but he never really taught her the ways of the world. And her mother had died in childbirth, as I recall. And her father died then of old age, but he had really made no provisions for her. And she had to get a job as a governess. And so now suddenly, without a home, she's homeless, without any money. He really didn't have any money. She's thrown at the mercy of society. She becomes a governess. And that what that means is just that she's completely vulnerable. If the slightest thing happens to her, she's going to tumble off that ladder and end up on a ship. And that's exactly what happened. So those women, this is a good moment for me to tell my little history story. Can I do that? Okay. So, we won the war, we Americans, in 1776. And so before 1776, the British had been, and a lot of Americans don't know this, the British had been in the habit of sending their prisoners to America, dumping them here. So more than 50,000 British prisoners were brought here, and they worked on plantations. They were called indentured servants. Many of them did eventually earn their freedom, but it was a lot of them. So, and in fact, Benjamin Franklin said, if Britain insists on sending their prisoners to America, then we should send back bags of rattlesnakes to them. There was all this kind of discord about it. So when America won the war, they immediately put a stop to that enterprise. No more prisoners from England. And England was a little flummoxed because they were used to offloading their undesirables. And they looked around. At first, they thought about Africa, but then they realized that the ports were dangerous. The shores were rocky. It was hard to land, whatever. There were these issues with that. And then they looked at this great continent of Australia that no one had quite had the wherewithal to conquer, I guess. The Dutch had been there and the French, but nobody was doing all that much with it. So they came up with this plan literally 1777. They came up with this plan to send convicts. So they start shipping men over. And by 1803, Australia was 9-1 men to women. And so what happened then is that the British government realized that they had a problem. They wanted to establish a colony, not just a penal colony. They wanted to actually eventually have respectable citizenry. So they began coming up with the flimsiest of pretenses for sending women over. And they would sweep them off the streets for vagrancy, for very petty crimes, and even for not really crimes at all. Prostitution was not illegal, but standing on street corners could be illegal. So there was that kind of thing. And eventually, what happened is that these women did, in fact, do exactly that. They populated Australia. So I just thought that was a really fascinating.
It's very intense
story.
And like you say, I mean, and of course, Hazel goes to, in your character, ends up in Australia for stealing a silver spoon. Whereas Evangeline ends up in Australia for something she didn't even do. So you get that sense that it's a very sort of callous judicial process. It's just sending the women, putting them on the boat as quickly as they can to get them on their way to Australia. But going back to the orphan thing, and it's related to this. I sort of felt like, for me, one of the strongest, most powerful themes in the book is these individuals who go through phases of isolation. And of course, being an orphan is one of the most profound forms of isolation that the human can experience, where suddenly you're cut off from your family. You don't have a family. But over the course of the book, people are imprisoned. Put into solitary confinement. They lose their connections with others, and go to a foreign country where they whether it's the young Indigenous girl who's suddenly transported in an English household, or the Brits who are showing up in Australia. They're all kind of isolated, and so what was interesting about it is that, for me, is it's very much a book about, having said that, it's very much a book about human connection. And I kept thinking of the Forster, only connect, his great sort of command, as it were. And these individuals who are isolated sort of by circumstance, by injustice, find their way to those who persevere, find their way ultimately to make some kind of connection, which saves them in essence, right? I mean, just to connect with anybody. And so that sort of felt like the orphans were symbolic for that entire process, right? You take that individual who is alone and stripped of connection, and then you throw them into the world in this hostile sort of circumstances, and that yet they pursue, a genuine connection that they're trying to find.
even the ones who weren't orphaned were isolated and alone. That's the whole point. They were sent to what the British courts called the land beyond the seas. And what that meant is that every sentence, whether it was 7 or 14 years or life, was essentially a life sentence because there was no returning. So to realize that, so the women didn't really understand what was happening to them as it went along. It took a while for them to realize that they were going 4 to 6 months away on a ship.
Right.
They would probably never see anyone again that they knew. So they were completely alone. And connection for that reason became even more important at the same time that it was precarious. Because how do you trust anyone? Who do you trust?
Right.
And how do you figure out a way to navigate a life where you're never in control? And this is one of the things about being an exile for all of my characters, my Aboriginal character and the convict women, that none of them had control over their destinies. Someone else could easily shove you down the ladder. And, many convict women ended up going back and going back and going back. And sometimes it was because they broke rules. And sometimes it was because other people got them in trouble. I mean, it was, there was betrayal. There were all kinds of things like that. Not to mention the men who preyed on them. I mean, so imagine that too. These women who go to this foreign land and they don't have anyone advocating for them at all. But to your point about connect, I just want to say this, because one of the things I learned teaching in that very, I want to say life deprived, but that prison where you had so few options, is that I was struck by how seriously, how these women built a life for themselves, built lives for themselves that were rich and full, actually. If you think about the fact that you might have to spend 20, 30, 40 years in this place, you're going to build a life there. And so what that meant is that, for example, we had conversations about how they had a really limited commissary where they could buy like ramen noodles and soy sauce and I don't know what, MSG and, some canned peas. And they came up with really elaborate recipes that they traded with each other. They cooked for each other. There was a lot of that kind of stuff. They made quilts together. They were figuring out ways to make it bearable. Not only bearable, but they were making, I believe, finding real connections with each other.
Sure.
Yeah. So that was useful to me because you sort of think of people going away to prison, especially for life, and that's the end of it, sort of. That's the end of their life, kind of. But no, human beings can exist in all kinds of circumstances. So that was really useful for me as I was writing the book. Like, how do I show that this is a difficult circumstance, and yet there are these moments of great joy as well? No
question. And of course, you on the road to that, any individual would have to explore their own resiliency, right? To find reservoirs of strength or to survive the more challenging aspects in the hopes of having those connections on the other side of endurance, as it were. And so, the book is very powerful in that sense too. One of the things that recurs throughout the novel, it's almost a motif, is many of the key characters come into contact in one way or another with the Tempest, whether they've seen it or they learn to read for the first time by reading it, or whether they borrow it, and the book kind of is there, kind of recurring throughout the novel. Now, of course, the Tempest is itself a fable being trapped on an island, right? So, but I'd love to hear you talk about, of the Tempest's role in the book why the Tempest and why did that feel like the right book to have playing throughout the story?
There were a number of things in my novel that were sort of passing the baton from one character to the next. In fact, I actually, when I envisioned it to begin with, I envisioned that idea that Evangeline would pass a baton to Hazel, Hazel would pass a baton to Ruby, and that Mathena would sort of be coming in and out of those stories. And there were other things like that as well. Evangeline has this story that her father told her about how the rings of a tree are the people you care about, and that gets passed through. And Mathina has a story about the shells on her necklace that her mother made are the people you love, and that you are the thread. There were, and so for literature too, I felt that Evangeline was the educated character. She had, so like Evangeline, I had seen The Tempest as a child at an open air. It might have even been in Stratford. I was born in England and lived there when I was young, and we went back a number of years. I lived in England for a total of 9 years. So I saw The Tempest several times in England, and I was really struck by the storm-tossed waves and the island that they went to and the strangeness of it. And I thought, what a great metaphor for these convict women coming, to Australia, to Tasmania, not only Australia, but this even kind of wilder, less cultivated place, Tasmania at the time, which is the size of Ireland, and recognizing nothing. And in The Tempest, one of the things that happens is there are all these phantasmagorical creatures. And in Tasmania, there were kangaroos and wallabies and koalas and all these creatures that none of these people had ever seen before. So I loved that sense of strangeness and wonder. And Evangeline has the book, and she, or I guess the surgeon on the ship has it. She loves it. She's already read it. She kind of teaches Hazel about it, and Hazel has seen it in Glasgow. Shakespeare was performed all the time in the 19th century. And so I loved that idea that she would have an oral history of it in her own mind, not a written record. She couldn't read at the time. Evangeline teaches Hazel to read. So that felt like a really meaningful connection for them. And then I played that out, in the book as it went along too.
I'm digging to my memory, but is Prospero, is he an exile himself?
Yeah.
He is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But you mentioned the Tempest as a book partly, but as a story is being passed from character to character to character, and we have some span of time here. Most of the book is set in the around the 1840s, but there is some events that occur 20 years later, in essence.
At the very end, you learn what happened. Yeah.
It was very satisfying. But among those objects that are passed along is, and it's quite fascinating, is the young women who are boarding the boat to travel months as convicts to be exiled into Australia are given by a religious figure, in essence, a necklace with a medallion with a number on it. The main character is, 171, I think. Sorry, 117, 171.
Very good memory, yes.
Dyslexic there. I think that becomes a talisman, which is sort of passed from over multiple hands over the course of the book. As is, there's a ruby ring, which gets passed, from hand to hand. The necklace that you mentioned. In the handkerchief, So you have these sort of four objects which are sort of moving throughout the book, going from hand to hand. And so I was kind of interested in your thoughts about, the power of objects, because obviously these do have very powerful meaning, not simply thematically as for us as readers, but to the individuals in the story. Can you talk about sort of how you think about the power of objects?
Yeah, this is not exactly, I suppose, an object, but a quote that I've always loved from Aeschylus is when he about the Oresteia, I think he said, "This house, if it had voice, would speak aloud and plain." That idea of an inanimate object or place that holds, witness. That is witness, that holds emotion too, and that is has a story to tell. And so I've always loved that idea of inanimate objects representing things and different things to different people. But in my, I just want to say about the ending that I've never written a fully satisfying ending before, I don't think. I mean, it was such a joy to write because I could have ended actually. I could have ended before the final chapter, which jumps ahead, and the child has grown up, and you learn what happened to a bunch of the characters. And you also have this kind of incredible sense of closure because you're going back to the very first page of the story.
Yeah.
And you learn what happened to those people as well. And I was just kind of that was the most fun I've ever had writing anything, I think, because I was just so taken with the idea that I was going to show what happened. I've had this, I don't know, I'm not sure why. Well, I think it was kind of a like literary writer idea that I didn't want to tie things up, in the past and kind of leave people to draw their own conclusions. But in this story, it was so overtly an adventure story in a way that I felt that it would not be fair if I didn't kind of try to figure out what happened next. But the other reason I did it, and the other reason I kind of love doing it so much, is that it really shows how Australia very quickly went from a penal colony to a place of great social change and development, and this capitalist society. In England, there was virtually no social mobility. If you were on the bottom rung, you stayed there in the mid-19th century. And in Australia, these convict women, they had it tough. But if you survived prison and you got out, eventually there were a lot more opportunities than there were in England. So that was kind of an exciting thing to show. And in the final chapter, the female doctor I described who's opening this London hospital for women is a real person, and that really happened. And she brought in all these apprentices from all over. And the female hospital that opens in 1899 in Melbourne is also a real place, founded by women. So I had all this historical data to go on, but I loved being able to show that.
Is that true? I mean, the medallion that the convict women wear, with the number on it, there's this great sort of moment where the main character, I'm not giving anything away with this, but the main character makes the leaps to the first interpretation that any of us would in the modern era, which is like, oh, you're assigning a number to me. This is terrible. But the person who's giving it to her is like, who's a woman of the cloth, says, well, no, actually, we give you that for your own safety. Because, that's the way that you go in the book as 171. And when the boat lands, we want to make make sure all the people are here. And it's the number that's going to guarantee your safety in theory. That's sort of the idea. And which was a great sort of twist on how to interpret that. But I did find myself wondering, were those medallions real? Is that something or is that an invention of yours?
They were real, and I loved that idea. Elizabeth Fry was a real person. She was a Quaker reformer. She was known as the angel of the prison. She was actually related to Florence Nightingale, and she was a wealthy woman who just made her life's work, sort of reforming Newgate Prison, looking after female inmates, and then helping the women who boarded the boats to Australia. But so her point was, as you said, that if they weren't identified by a number, they could easily just be lost. They could fall overboard. They could, and nobody would know, and nobody would quite be accountable for what happened to them. She also gave them materials to sew with, and she gave them clothes to wear, Bibles, of course. There is, though, debate about how prevalent that was. I worked with this incredible historian in Australia named Alison Alexander, who's written 33 books about convict history and Australian history. And she thinks that Elizabeth Fry's influence may have been exaggerated. There were a lot of things like that I was working with people who know everything about these subjects. And so when you write about history, there's always a question of how far you adhere to what really happened and when you break away from that.
One other question, we're about to shift to the Q&A, so I wanted to ask you another sort of question on the sort of motif/thematic level. Throughout the book, naming plays a key role in sort of these subtle ways that keep recurring. One of them being the one we just discussed, is that this number, the way the name is, it may protect you in some way, and that number then survives that young woman, and that medallion is, people care about it and carry it. But there's a young convict woman who is shocked and pleasantly that the physician on the boat knows how to recognize her by name at some point. Having assumed that no one would ever know their names. Yeah. And that sort of a humanizing moment for sort of everybody in the triangle, as it were. But there's also there's the island that and I can't pronounce her name. The young indigenous girl.
I pronounce it Mathina.
Okay, Mathina. Thank you. Mathina, observes that the island that she cares so much about in the span of a globe is so small that it isn't even named, and that she sort of ties that to the fact that her people are being erased, because they don't have the name, and so. So I was kind of fascinated by this sort of thread of the names and of the roles they play in our sense of identity, or whether it's a place or a person, and whether you had kind of any thoughts about that, because it is a big thread in the story.
Yeah, that was such an important part of the narrative, because these people, both the convict women and the Aboriginal people, were being stripped of their identities, essentially. The Aboriginal people were being chased off their hunting grounds. The hunting grounds were being fenced in, and sheep by the millions were brought over. And so all of a sudden, the lands that they'd been able to move freely over were blocked to them, and the British were shooting at them for trying to hunt as they did. They were hunter-gatherers, and that was how they lived. And so then there's a debate about whether what happened to the Aboriginal people in Tasmania was genocide. But the truth is that in 1803, when the British came there were thousands of them. And by the mid-19th century, there were very few. The remaining Aboriginal people had been rounded up and put on this, essentially an open-air concentration camp, Flinders Island, which is where Mathina was born. Mathina, in my novel, is actually, she's a historical figure. She's a real person. She existed. And the story that I told about her is as close as I could get to the real story about her. When my novel starts, she's 8, but she was 5 actually when she was taken in by the governor and his wife. So she also had been given a series of names. I don't know if you remember that, but she was called Mary, and then eventually called Mathina. The convicts aren't even called by their names mostly, so they have very little identity. And this is, again, part of what the book is about, is how do you exist when essentially you're stripped of your identity. Mathina was completely stripped of who she was, and so were the women. And I will say that what happened to the convict women was terrible, but at least they had an opportunity for social change, and that Mathina, this Aboriginal girl, and those people really didn't. So that was very different.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
It's time to take questions from the audience. So, all right, our first one. Thank you, Christina, for the shout out to our piece in Poets and Writers. Oh, this is from Lisa Gornick on historical fiction. In that exchange, we explored the range of opinions among fiction writers with regard to how obligated they feel to the historical record. Could you talk about your thoughts about that with respect to the Exiles?
Sure. Can I ask Amor to answer too? Will you answer too? So, I keep thinking that I'm going to feel less obligated to the historical record, and then I keep wanting to stick to it as much as I can. The Mathina, as I said, I made her older because I wanted her to have a more fully developed consciousness, but that was not an easy decision to make because, as I said, she was a real person. As much as possible, I tried to get the facts of the story right, because most people don't know a lot about the convict women, and I didn't want to be misleading about how they ended up on the ships, what their experience was like. I was careful to set the novel in the 1840s because, believe it or not, the convict women's lives were much easier than they were earlier, like in the 1820s, when they had been brought over essentially as breeders and were released into the care of whatever man wanted a woman. So they would, if you stood at the top of the gangplank and there was a crowd of men at the bottom, there had been a notice in the paper, and someone chose you, then your sentence was commuted and you were essentially in his care or property. It was a really brutal system, as you might imagine. And when the British press eventually started writing about it, the government was like, well, maybe we should build some prisons and get a little more respectable. So I watched a movie when I finished a draft of the novel called The Nightingale, which interestingly was produced by the team who bought my book. And I don't think it's a coincidence. It was really a brutal movie, much more brutal than my book, and great, but really harsh. And I called my editor and said, I'm afraid that am I not diving deep enough into the real deprivation of that experience, into the hard part? And she said, no, I actually think you are diving deep enough into it. There's a lot of hardship that you describe. So in terms of getting the facts right, I really did want to show the experience. At the same time that, as Amor said, you can't have that relentless, you can't do that relentlessly without showing what it's like to be human and what it means to be human, the connections people make.
Right.
And Amor, what about you? I know we've talked about this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, I think that every writer who is whether they're writing in the contemporary environment or about the contemporary environment or the past, every writer has their own sort of way of filtering reality through their own imagination and through their own artistic goals. And I don't think there are hard and fast rules about how loyal to history one should be. The way I like to think of it is, Henry V is still an extraordinary play by Shakespeare, and it's still engaging and informative and moving, whether you see the play or read the play or watch the Kenneth Branagh film version, in the original Shakespeare. But when Shakespeare wrote that play, or when we watch it or read it, we're not turning to Shakespeare for a document on the 100 Years' War, or the Battle of Agincourt, or however you pronounce it. That we're not turning to him for that, and nor is he particularly interested in that. He's not trying to make sure that he's got the temperature on the battlefield right, or the number of soldiers right, or even the day of St. Crispin's Day, he's going to get that right. But the battle is a backdrop for him. He's much more interested in human issues, and such as how does in the case of that play, how does a young man who was a gambler and a drinker and a philanderer, suddenly become a king of great honor and courage? How does that happen in a young man's life? That you can make that transition, and that how do we think about what it means to be when we go to war for England against France? What does that mean? What is England? What is this thing England that we, this varied group of people from across this island, are somehow we feel that we are bound together, and that the French are somehow very different, and we would give our life to make sure that we don't become the French. What does that mean to be English or to be French? And these are the things that interest him. And so he's not. And if you start bringing all the historical detail into that play, it would wear it down and bog it down, and and it would become something different. It would become a history. A work of history as opposed to a history play. And so I do like to think, I keep in mind as my own work that what am I trying to achieve? And if I am trying to bring the characters to life and to bring certain themes to life, and to get windows on historical events that serve that story, then I am absolutely willing to take latitude in how those things play out. But I do think we live in a time where people seem more obsessed than at any point in history with the factual accuracy of novels, and I was kind of amused by that, because I think people are reading with such a fine filter that to some degree they're missing the pleasure of reading what is a fictive form.
Yeah, and can I just add one thing about that? In this novel and in all of these novels, I stumbled into writing about the past. I wrote contemporary novels. I don't know how it happened, but anyway, I did. And one
was Orphan Train the first time you did that?
Yeah, Orphan Train is actually only a third set in the past, 2/3 of it's in the present day. So it was a slippery slope. And then I wrote a novel that was set in the 1940s, and I didn't really consider that historical, but I suppose it is. And then this one is definitely set in the past. But anyway, somehow, as I said, I fell down this embankment of historical whatever. But I will say that my greatest task in writing this book, and I hope readers find this, feel this, is that I wanted to ultimately be ruthless with absolutely every historical detail that had nothing to do with my story. And you do all this research, and so you write your scenes, and sometimes, you studied all this stuff, and so you put it in, and I had to just say, if my character doesn't see, feel, or experience this, then it doesn't have any place in the book. And so you end up, of course, doing way more research than your story seems to require, but it's part of the process. And ultimately, all I cared about was the rhythm of the sentences, the dialogue, trying to make the dialogue as trenchant as possible, establishing connections between characters so that they live and breathe. And all that historical detail means absolutely nothing if you don't do that. And to be honest with you, I don't read a lot of fiction set in the past because I feel, because I come up against that a lot. It feels like that the research is
weighing it down,
learning something. That Seinfeld line, no hugging, no learning. That's how I feel about writing fiction set in the past. People will learn from reading my books, but that's not the point of them necessarily. Someone said the other day, this guy who reviewed this novel said I kept running to the internet, to Wikipedia or whatever, to check things. And that's great, fine, run to Wikipedia and check things, but don't expect that I'm going to give you a complete history in this story.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. Barbara asks, interesting how you said Piece of Earth, my favorite so far. You caught me reading it the third time in Kauai. Takes place in the Olsen's kitchen, and Exiles is action with different settings. How was this for your writing process? Slow pacing versus fast pacing, and dialogue and characters' inner feelings.
Actually, Piece of Earth is maybe a better title than Piece of the World. That book was so hard. I always say, do you feel this way, Amor? My new book is always the hardest. But that book was so hard. This book was hard in a different way. It was sort of sprawling. It was hard to rein in. It was hard to pare back. That book, I love that book, but nothing happens. Nothing happens. This woman is in her house and she never leaves her house. That's the story of the book. So every moment of drama, I had to completely manufacture. I had to create out of thin air. And the process of writing it was so painful. First of all, because they were real people. And the Wyeth family is still very much around, and they care about their representation on the page. But also, all the people I was writing about lived almost to a person. I'm trying to think if I made up one character, and that was tough. But more than that it was a story that didn't have a natural progression forward. And so when I started the Exiles, I had this great liberty in that I was moving from this place to this place to this place. You wrote a novel that is entirely set in one place also.
Right. Yeah. It's a bigger place. It's a bigger place than a house in Maine.
You had a lot of rooms.
Yeah, that's an advantage. People coming and going all the time.
Yeah, definitely.
But I like that. I was thinking, one of the things I was thinking about your novel, which in retrospect, The Exiles, is that, because it didn't feel like this when I was reading it, but in retrospect, I realized that maybe it's a third of the book, maybe even closer to a half, is set either in prison or on a boat. The boat is on about 20% of the crossing, but there's some prison time before, during, after, so you're doing kind of what I often have said, that of A Gentleman in Moscow, that putting a person in a building and writing about where you don't let him leave the building, to me, that kind of a version of that is Moby Dick, which is I'm not saying I'm as good as Herman Melville by any means, but because I'm a big fan of Melville's, but he's a big hero of mine. But Moby Dick is basically structured, at the beginning, Ishmael comes to town, gets a job, gets on board, and he does not get off that boat again until the last page, and what that
Moby Dick. Were you thinking of that as you wrote it?
No, but I get the nature of the challenge, right? Which is that for Melville or for any of as I say, if you're writing your characters in prison in a book or on a boat, you have to bring the world into the space, right? You're accepting this confinement of space, but also a small group of people, like in the case of Moby Dick, and you're not going to get others. You're not going to get more people. You're not going to get more space, and so instead, what Melville has to do is he has to bring the world into the boat, through illusion and through the history of whaling and the commerce of whaling and Shakespearean poetry and the backgrounds of the individual characters, and sort of all the life starts to bubble up through the investigation of all the different ways that you can look at what's happening in that vessel. And I think my instincts are that that turned as an electricity for his effort. If the boat could come to land and they all get off the boat and go into town, it would make it harder in a way to write the book well, right? It's the confinement that really forces him to do all these incredible things that bring that book to life. And yes, I think a similar thing happened for me in A Gentleman on Moscow by limiting 95% of the book to the building itself. It allows you kind of to draw on all the tools you can to bring life, within the space, bring life to the book.
Yeah, I kind of felt like I learned how to write a novel when I wrote that book, because you drew on only your own resources. And Moby Dick is a great comparison to yours. I thought of Long Day's Journey like a play, Long Day's Journey into Night, where you're just there. You have, or Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I mean, the idea of a slow build, all these relationships, not only a few people, but you learn as it goes along the depth of mistrust or long-held resentments or whatever, and that eventually that will come to a head. And so as I was writing it, I had that in my mind, that it was almost like a stage set, this house that they're inside and they can't leave.
Right.
It's funny how I think every novel is different, a different experience in that way too, and that you set the parameters of your canvas, of your world that you're building, and then you have to live with it, and that can be really hard, and it can also be liberating in a way, because you say, here I am, this is what this is. I'm on a ship in the middle of the ocean now for 4 months, and this is where I am.
No, I think you're describing it well. It's probably not discussed enough in terms of the creation of novels, but it is very much an art form about setting rules. That as the novelist, you have to set rules, and the rules can be a variety of kinds. Whether it's a tone of perspective of is the story going to be told from one perspective or five? Is it going to be in a single period of time or stretch across time? The geographic or the physical versions that we're talking about. But there's all kinds of other rules that how trustworthy is the narrator going to be? Is there going to be an element of magical realism? Is it going to be true to history in the way that we were talking about earlier? And the novel allows us to do anything, but what it asks of us is to set some rules and then abide by them and maximize the experience of the novel while operating within those rules. And we can feel it as readers that when suddenly the rule is broken that the writer and themselves have set, it feels like it breaks the book, Yeah. And so, but there's enormous liberty, and we can see it by looking at Marquez, as a form of narrative. Is just, where, and then it rained for the next, whatever it was, 5 years or whatever, wow, but he set the rule.
Who goes, does this sort of, the boxes within boxes of his stories, his novels that unfold in these experimental ways, but they're very tightly constructed, so that you always trust that that he knows exactly what he's doing, and that you're going to end up somewhere really interesting.
Yeah, and so that's part of the fun of the writing process, is figuring out what are the rules that this story demands, and And ideally, they're different than the rules of the last book you wrote, right? So that it's a new adventure for you or a new challenge. And
okay, so do you feel with the book you're writing now that you've set yourself new rules?
Yeah, my new book, which I'm trying to finish the first draft of in the next 2 months or so, is about 3 18-year-old boys and an 8-year-old boy who go from Nebraska to New York City in 1954. But, along the lines we're talking about, that book, the whole book is only 10 days. And whereas Gentleman Moscow is 32 years. And, that's a major structural change. Is a different kind of rule, where you're going to go through each individual day. And it means that you cannot do certain things, and there's other things you can do, and intensely. And so it kind of changes the framework. The fact that it's a bunch of 18-year-old boys is a big difference, too.
It's huge. What was there a spark for you? 10 days, Nebraska to...
No, I haven't, but when I write the acknowledgement, I'll find it, just like you.
Exactly.
So I think we have time for one more question. Can you discuss your writing from a character's perspective that is not of your own culture? Your Aboriginal character in this case. I asked for 2 reasons. The recent conversation around this over the last couple of years, and this is Leanne Summers. She says, "In my own book has characters and perspectives from a culture not my own."
Yeah. So as I told you, when I began this story, when I began the research for it, and I began thinking about writing this, I thought I would just be writing about the convict women. I truthfully didn't know how entwined in the mid-19th century, how that story of the Aboriginal people in Tasmania was fraught, complicated, and present in a way that I didn't understand. And so as I began doing research, I went to Tasmania twice. It was called Van Diemen's Land back then, but they changed it in the mid to late 19th century to erase the stain of the convict stain, as they called it. So Van Diemen's Land at the time, as I said, had this very fraught history. And I found the story of Mathina, or Mathina, I call her Mathina. And I realized that she was taken in by Sir John Franklin, who became an Arctic explorer, who's renowned for that, but eventually ended up dying with his whole crew in the Arctic, and his wife, Lady Jane Franklin, who was quite a public figure, as a sort of social experiment. And it was at exactly the time that I had already planned to set my novel. So I thought, as I began working on the comic story, it became clearer and clearer to me that it would be irresponsible not to engage this other story in some way. And Mathina seemed like the right way to do that. At the same time that I recognize that I am not an Indigenous person and have, and that it's a complicated undertaking to write about a culture that isn't your own culture. So I did all I can do. I researched, I was there. I had an incredible man who named Dr. Gregory Lehman, who is himself descended from Tasmanian Aboriginal people and is a professor of Aboriginal history. He consults with museums, with other writers, and he was fantastic. And I had many people read the manuscript. But I ultimately I did as well as I could do with the tools I have, and other people would write the story differently. But as I said, I felt I had to do it, and I don't know. I only did as well as I can do, and so I hope that people will feel that she breathes, on the page as the other characters do. The one thing I will say is that my guiding principle as I was writing it is that otherness is imposed from the outside. And so you were getting her story from her perspective, and she was absorbing what other people were telling her she was, but it wasn't who she knew she was. So, and it was true of the convict women as well. In both cases, I had this rule for myself, which was that what other people told them they were wasn't necessarily how they experienced themselves, and that disconnect was part of the important story that I wanted to tell about them. I don't know.
I could listen to you two talk for hours, truly. Thank you both so much for this fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you, Amor, so much for doing this with me.
My pleasure. And Christina, congratulations again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, congratulations, Christina. We're all excited to read for those of us who haven't had a chance yet. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We'll see you all again soon, I hope.
Great. All right. Thank you.